Oh, there it is. Okay, I'm on. Great. Alrighty, folks. Welcome back. Good to see everybody. Welcome, online folks. We're back to business. First of all, questions from you guys before we do a little bit more epistemology. I like to always try to start by, and we've done a little bit now, so maybe some folks have questions. If you do, I'm happy to field them. One question before class started was about the final paper, and I haven't made any details other than what's in the syllabus, which is pretty sparse, available to you yet, but I will. I have a list of paper topic ideas, questions that are tied to different readings, and I'm thinking about maybe even putting some readings on reserve, because the anthology that we're using this time, it's the first time I'll have used that anthology. I've used other stuff, and I'm always sort of shopping around. And it's okay. I mean, I'm not in love with it, so there might be some papers that I know of that I'd kind of rather see people write about just because it's more fun for me to read. Self-interested motivation. So maybe I'll put some of that stuff out there, and I'll try to make a list of paper topics and questions available. I'm not going to promise it within the next week or two, but maybe. I've learned not to promise, because you guys are really good at remembering promises and holding me to it. But I'll get that out there for you, and some sort of rubric as well, so you have some idea. But no surprises. I think I said, 7 to 10 pages or something like that. All the usual sort of thing, and looking more for a philosophy paper. So hopefully by this point you've written some philosophy papers. So less a kind of book report and more setting up a view, explaining any of the terminology that needs to be explained, and then reconstructing an argument or two, and then evaluating the argument, and then maybe some responses to your objection or defense of an argument. So that's the basic idea. Other things, I guess last time we were kind of at the end of chapter 1, right? So if you've got questions about any of that remaining stuff, now's a good time. If you don't, then the plan for today is to try to knock out chapter 2 as best we can. There's a lot of stuff in there. I think some of it can go kind of fast. So chapter 2 is Feldman's sort of setting up what he calls the traditional analysis of knowledge, right? TAK. And this is the sort of the ground zero question that I mentioned from last time, that first question that's prompted by the standard view, which is, what is knowledge, right? I mean, this is a course in epistemology, and you're here at the university paying money to gain knowledge, right? We all pay lip service to the idea that knowledge is a good thing. There are slogans, knowledge is power, right? And most of us think that more knowledge is better. All of that seems, at first blush to be right, but what exactly is it that is the topic of this course, right, is the primary subject matter? So it'd be nice to be able to have an actual definition of what it is that we're investigating, right? It'd be kind of embarrassing if we can't do that. So to that end, we're going to be looking at how he constructs this initial proposal. Now, the traditional analysis of knowledge, TAK, which eventually I'll have another acronym for it that is familiar in the literature, but I'll wait and not steal my own thunder. The traditional analysis of knowledge, you can see the sort of seeds of this all the way back in antiquity, in Plato. So if we've got folks here that are fans of ancient philosophy, I'm sure there are some. I've had Professor Rosenfeld, perhaps. And then from reading your Plato that Plato addresses this topic in Meno, as well as in a later dialogue, the Theaetetus, which is one of the sort of the third late period dialogues of Plato's. And you can find the sort of the seeds of this that all the way back there, right? So it's kind of interesting. Plato seems to suggest at the end of Theaetetus that knowledge is true belief with an account. And there's, of course, scholarly debate among Plato scholars over exactly what he means by account, but that gives you sort of the rough idea. Before we jump into the TAK, though, I wanted to just kind of go sort of slowly through the chapter, in part because I think it's a good opportunity for you to ask questions as we come across things, and also to make sure that I don't miss anything, right? So if you have, and it's probably a good idea to bring the book to class with you. If you don't have it, it's okay today, but I do like to kind of go through some of it in a little bit of detail because, as I've said before, one of the good things about his writing style is that it's straightforward, it's clear, there's not a lot of fluff in there, so it's direct, and I appreciate that. I like that. The sort of the downside to that, if it is a downside, is just that because it reads in that sort of easy way, right, stylistically, you can kind of go through it quickly and think, oh, I've got it, and move on. And sometimes there's details there that are worth spending a little bit of time on. So I don't plan to didactically lecture through this whole thing today, but we'll see. I think people have questions as we go along. As always, I've been looking at the discussion boards, and I appreciate those of you who have since posted. It helps me to kind of figure out which direction I want to go in our meetings and how to tailor things. So what he starts with in Chapter 2 is this idea of different kinds of knowledge, right? And some of this, I think, in retrospect, is an exercise in part to get folks familiar with the idea of conceptual analysis. Now, if you've had multiple 300-level courses here at UNCG in the philosophy department, then probably you already have that down, but I don't want to presuppose that because people have different levels of background, and the same with folks in the online shell. So it's probably worth time taking a minute to go through this. And again, partly it's instructive about how analyses work and what we're after. So this first part here, different kinds of knowledge, right? We notice, and I'm an ordinary language type philosopher, so in other words, we could sit around and talk about constructing an idealized concept of knowledge, and now more than ever there are people out there, folks in artificial intelligence and people who are working in different areas, perhaps in neuroscience, that are interested in trying to sort of do better than us, right? So build something smarter than the human brain that can know even more, have more capacity there. And that's all interesting stuff to think about, but my main concern is ordinary knowledge, right? Commonplace sort of stuff, as well as philosophical claims to know. But so I start with our ordinary language, and that brings along with it a whole bunch of considerations. And some of this is just kind of hand-waving on my part, right? Because we're not in the philosophy of language course. But for people that are skeptical about language, they're skeptical about meaning, they distrust language for various reasons, then there's always that angle, right? Somebody might, so to kind of reference back an example here, during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s in Anglo-American philosophy, there was a kind of movement known as logical positivism, sometimes called verificationism. And there was a sort of rift among a lot of these folks over whether or not we should take language at face value and kind of work with what we've got, what we find ourselves with, or whether we should scrap language altogether because it's got so many problems associated with it, right? There's ambiguity, and there's vagueness, and there's metaphor, and there's irony, and all these there's different natural languages, and what if there are concepts in one language that you can't translate into another language, which inevitably there would seem to be, and so on, right? All these kinds of questions made some philosophers during that period think that we'd be better off to kind of construct an ideal language. So you have people like Bertrand Russell, at least for a while, kind of flirting with this idea of an ideal language. And you have other people saying, no, better to stay close to home so that whatever we come up with at the end of the day is tied back to our actual practice, right? So I don't really want to have to take a stand on that. I think both projects can be interesting and probably have a place, but like Feldman, I'm sort of inclined to stick close to natural language and just sort of settle in with the fact that there are going to be these sort of, obvious kinds of issues that creep up involving vagueness, ambiguity, and so on. So one of the things he starts off with here is the idea that the word knows in English, right, gets used in lots of different ways. We say all kinds of different things and use that word, right? So some examples here, I'll just read them at you. Kinds of knowledge. Knowing an individual. So S knows X. He uses Salinger. Must have been on a Catcher in the Rye kick or something at the time. Good book. So the professor knows J.D. Salinger. That's an example, right? Knowing who. S knows who X is. The student knows who J.D. Salinger is. So there's knowing an individual, knowing who someone is, knowing whether, right? S knows whether P. And again, I mentioned just really quickly in passing last time this sort of apparatus, right? This schema of S knows that P. I'll come back to that maybe in a little bit and say some more. Again, some of this, if you've seen a lot of this kind of stuff before, or you've had upper level courses where there was a heavy dose of analysis, I'm thinking about maybe Professor Rosenkranz's Philosophy of Religion. Show of hands, how many people have had that? So, okay, well, I'm glad I'm doing this then. You know what I'm talking about. You've seen it, yeah. So this is the epistemological kind of analog of that approach. So it's kind of analytic. Knowing whether, so the librarian knows whether there's a book by J.D. Salinger in the library, right? That's a locution that we use involving the word knows. Knowing when, S knows when a will or did happen. So, for example, the editor knew when J.D. Salinger's book would be published. Number 5 here, knowing how. S knows how to A. So J.D. Salinger knows how to write, right? And then 6, S knowing facts. S knows P. The student knows that J.D. Salinger wrote The Catcher in the Rye. So all of these are examples, right, of ways in which we use the word knows in English in everyday life, right? And they raise questions just right off the bat, right? I mean, one thought might be, is there some fundamental or primary sense of the word? Is there one that's basic? Now, whether that occurred to you right off the bat or not before you went much further. And I sometimes will encourage you to, as you're reading through Feldman, maybe when you come across one of those kind of moments, stop and think about it for yourself before you read the next paragraph and let him solve it for you. Because he'll go quickly right into whatever the counterexample or the objection or the fix is. But as an exercise for you, the reader, and for your mind, it's good to kind of pause and go slowly and think about it and say, okay, well, here's all these different expressions. There might even be more. He doesn't make the claim that this is complete, right? So there might be other ways in which we use the word knows in English. And a natural kind of thing, at least natural for philosophers, if there is such a thing, right, is to kind of wonder, is there one that's basic, that's fundamental? So the idea there would be, can we explain, say, a handful of these other senses of knows in terms of one that's presumably the basic one or the most fundamental one? Now, if you've read it, which I assume you have, then you know that a standard kind of thing is to try to account for as much knowledge as possible in terms of propositional knowledge. Why is that? Well, I mean, the short answer is I suppose there's a kind of bias in favor of propositional knowledge. I mean, again, this is armchair speculation. It's not really part of the content of the course, but it's in some ways the same reason we have lots of courses in formal logic and not too focused on deductive logic, right? And not so much on induction. Where's the course on inductive reasoning or inductive logic and formal methods there? It's messy. It's harder to deal with. It's not as clean cut, right? So propositional sort of knowledge, right? The last one on the list here, number 6. That's been the focus. That seems to have been kind of the one that everybody zeroed in on and thinks is the starting point. You might disagree with that. You might think, well, actually, that's a huge assumption. Why think that we have to start with propositions and propositional knowledge, factual knowledge, as it's often called, or declarative knowledge of facts? Why not start with something more fundamental than that, right? So kind of just a thing to think about there. So in any case, he then from this point goes and tries to show how we can explain at least some of these different notions, right, in terms of something more basic. Before I switch over to that, though, let me just stop for a second, see if people have thoughts, questions, comments about any of these. I'm open to anything at this point here. People feel pretty comfortable with the list? Anybody think of something that needs to be on there that's not, or doesn't like one of the kinds of knowledge that he mentions? All right. We can come back to this one if we need to. So let me show you the first one here that he does. And again, part of this is a kind of exercise, and that's okay. That can be valuable and useful just to get people up to speed, again, because I can't presuppose that everybody's seen this sort of stuff before, with the idea of definitions and examples and counterexamples, because this approach, I say this approach, the one that he's sort of taking and that we'll take in our time together, leans heavily on this idea of necessary and sufficient conditions and examples and counterexamples and intuitions. This is part of what I talked about last time in terms of the methodology that sort of undergirds the standard view. That's the subject of attack by people like naturalists and maybe relativists too, but certainly naturalized epistemologists, people that like the naturalistic view, have criticized this kind of approach for different reasons. And I won't say much about it. I'll try not to, at least. It's tempting. But I'll try to save that for when we get to the chapter on naturalized approaches. In any case, so here's the first one here. What are the prospects for a unified theory of knowledge? The idea of trying, and it would be cool, right? I mean, why would it be good? I don't know. Philosophers, they have a kind of thing for wanting to see if we can reduce everything down to some small stock of basic concepts, right? That's a kind of economy, just like in ontologies, right? It'd be, yeah, you could have an ontological framework that's got 500 different basic categories, but if we can eliminate a whole bunch of those and explain all of those 500, explain 100 of them in terms of, 2 or 3, then that's some savings. That's a kind of, there's an economic appeal to that. So can knowing whether be reduced to knowing that? So S knows whether P, and this, you'll see this from time to time here and elsewhere, equals DF period. This means equals by definition, right? So there's lots of different kinds of definitions. One kind of definition is a lexical definition, a dictionary definition. So if you go to dictionary.com or Merriam-Webster, whatever, that's what you're getting there, right? What we're trying to do is we're not trying to define in that way, right? We're sort of not a consensus about what we should call this sort of definition. You could think of it as a philosophical definition, perhaps. But we're not so much concerned with trying to get at the pre-existing meaning, but to show that we can take this left-hand side and we can explain that, right, in terms of something on the right-hand side, presumably something more basic, in this case something propositional, right? So we can eliminate knowing whether, right? We can sort of reduce that to the following, right? S knows whether P can equal by definition, or can be rendered as, cashed out in terms of, either S knows that P is true, or S knows that it's not the case that P is true. So what's the big deal there? Well, I mean, we've shown that that it's, in some ways it's kind of superfluous, right? Knowing whether we're still going to talk that way. We're still going to say Smith knows whether or not the Bulls won the game. But what that really means is that he knows that the Bulls won, or he knows that it's not the case that the Bulls won. Seem fair enough? Pretty good? All right. How about another one here? And I should hide the right-hand side, see if people can get it. So can knowing when be reduced to knowing that? What do people think about that? So S knows when A will or did happen, equals by definition. Another way to think about that is if and only if. And I'll say something about biconditionals and that project, necessary and sufficient conditions, when we get a little bit further. So anybody want to take a stab at that one before I reveal it? I should have hidden the first one. I'm bad about stealing my own thunder here. So how would you do that one? S knows when A will happen. Or did happen. Yeah, Susie, thanks.
Could be S knows that A will happen at his
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it. That's the basic idea, right? So in other words, there exists a time t, right, such that S knows that A will or did happen at t. Notice again what makes all of this count as reducing these seemingly different kinds of knowledge to propositional knowledge, factual knowledge, declarative knowledge, is that this is a proposition that S happens at t, right? So being able to sort of take these other uses of the word knows and show how they can actually be explained in terms of something propositional. Again, there's a kind of economy there. There's some theoretical oomph to that. And it's nice to be able to, again, we're not going to stop talking about knowing when or knowing whether. We'll still use that language. But looks like we can do one better there. What about this one? A little bit more interesting. Can knowing an individual be reduced to knowing that? I guess it depends on how optimistic you are as an epistemologist, right? Or some other facts about what exactly it is to know an individual. If you've read this, and I know everyone has, then you kind of know, right? So you might say S knows X, where X is some individual, equals by definition what? Well, S knows a whole bunch of propositions, P1, 2, 3, ... right? Where each of these propositions describes some fact about X, right? So Rick knows Santa Claus equals by definition. There's a whole bunch of facts about Santa Claus, that he lives at the North Pole, that he's wears the red suit, he's a reindeer, right? All these different things. Pick your favorite facts. Why we're doing Santa Claus, I don't know. Fictional entities, but they're fun. So in any case, right, you get a list of propositions that express truths about X, and you sort of say, hey, if you know enough of those, and again, that's something he doesn't even really address, but that's part of the puzzle here. Anybody see the problem? Yeah, Anthony. Yeah, thanks, Anthony. So yeah, for folks in the online version, Anthony just, kind of nailed it. Basically, you can know a ton of facts about some object, person, whatever, right? And still, you don't know that person, right? You could read a lot of biographies of Napoleon or J.D. Salinger, but you don't know Napoleon or Salinger. So here's kind of, again, I suspect part of Feldman's purpose in taking the time to do this, aside from the fact that it does have some philosophical, some epistemological interest. So the counterexample is that it looks like knowing a large number of facts about a person isn't going to be sufficient for knowing that person, right? So example here, a lot of people know a lot of facts about George Washington, right? Pick your favorite person, but no one alive today knows Washington. Seems like a problem. Now you might ask, okay, so much the worse for knowing an individual, but what does it take to know an individual? If you've got some great ideas concerning that, then that could be your paper topic. Little plug for paper topics. Let me just stop for a second, see if people have thoughts, questions this far. Yeah, Anthony, thanks.
Do you have a better definition for the three S knows about that?
Okay, yeah. So the problem there, though, is that and I appreciate, thanks for taking this on. So we've got a proliferation of senses of knows, right, in English. So we've got this word knows in English, and it gets thrown around in all these different senses, right? And we've listed 5 or 6, whatever it was, of them, and we want to see whether or not we could, wouldn't it be great if we could unify all of these different things down to just one primary sense, one core concept of knowledge. And I think your idea is tempting, right? But the thing is that if the goal is to try to get rid of knowing, knowing an individual, and we've got to come up with something that's propositional on the right-hand side. How are we going to explicate knowing about? I'd rather it be knowing. It needs to be knowing that. So then we're going to have to reduce S knows about X to something propositional. If I'm following you. Yeah. So I mean, I'm not. So it sounds to me like, yeah, I think I can agree with you and say, yeah, that's cool. We can say what it is to know an individual is to know about the individual, but then what is it to know about the individual? Well, is there any propositional way to go from there? It's not clear.
I guess adding about would also broaden it to just not individuals, but like events and stuff. So I guess it's not what we want.
Yeah, thanks. I hadn't even thought about that part of it. But yeah, presumably, yeah, so knowing an individual, knowing an event, knowing something of that sort. Does that make sense though?
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to figure out. I mean, I think you're on to something. It's interesting to think about, but we need to. Where do we go? How do we get factual stuff in the mix there? All right. What about another one here? This is the one that that gets discussed a lot, at least traditionally, historically. So maybe some of those other senses, like knowing whether, knowing who, knowing X, maybe those weren't the first ones that came to your mind when you think about senses of the word knows in English. But certainly knowing that, which is propositional knowledge, again, declarative knowledge, factual knowledge, I'll use those to all mean the same thing for our purposes. That's clearly one that pops up right away. That seems like a really important sense of the word knows, right? And then also knowing how. That's the other one, right? So Smith knows how to play the guitar, and Jones knows how to water ski, right? What is know? And we use that a lot, right? So from a traditional standpoint, a lot of time, or not a lot of time, but some time's been spent by folks in the past trying to see whether or not we could reduce knowing how to knowing that. Now you might think this doesn't sound very like a promising project right off the bat, because knowing facts, being able to represent and stand in some sort of relation to these propositions seems like a really different thing, right? Having a large database, in other words, of information contained in your brain or in your mind or whatever seems like a really different thing from being able to do anything, right? Yeah.
Yeah, couldn't you say this knows that some like action will create a reaction, so that like anything for a guitar, if I know that this will react end with that.
Well, that's what people want to say, or what people have tried to do, right? Yeah. So can we do? Let's just take a look at it and see. Can we do the reduction? S knows how to A, where A is some type of action. So S knows how to play the guitar, right? What would that look like? Well, if alpha is an important step in Aing, then S knows that alpha is an important step in Aing. Right? Is everybody buying it? Getting some quizzical looks. Yeah, Ethan?
You have muscle memory or stuff, and you don't actually know in your mind what's happening, but your body knows.
Right.
That's different from this, because this you have to know all the processes. Basically, to know how to do something, your body might know it, but you don't actually know it.
Yeah, that sounded like a contradiction at the end, but that's okay. I mean, I know what you're saying.
Your body might know, but you might not, your mind.
Explicitly have it represented as a set of propositions. Yeah. No, I think that's. I mean, when you think about it, I mean, just again, it seems kind of to me not promising to think that we're going to be able to get that reduction to work out. Now, I remember a few years, it's been a while back, but a buddy of mine in grad school was trying to come up with a reliabilist account of knowing how that I think was supposed to somehow be more promising for this, ultimately for this kind of program. We'll talk about reliabilism later, I think in Chapter 5. It's an approach to understanding what justification is. But in any case, I mean, is there anybody here that can play music just by ear? Like maybe you've got a guitar and you've never taken lessons, but you can just listen a little bit and then start goofing around, and the next thing you know, you've kind of figured it out. Yeah, me neither. I didn't. Not part of my skill set.
I used to be able to, but got out of practice.
But you have the ear for it. Yeah. See, I didn't get the ear for it. Philosopher, not rock star. So can't get it all. But yeah. But my grandmother could play the piano just by ear. Never had a lesson. No formal training. Doesn't know what the notes are. Can't read music. Any of this sort of stuff. Sit down and just play the piano. Incredible, great Christmas carols, Christmas songs. That's just it's something they know how to. Some people know how to do it, right? But and there's other folks who maybe have a tremendous, stockpile of knowledge of music theory, but they can't execute on it, right? So maybe you're a music theorist and you can listen and you can say, I know that that's this particular scale or this particular sequence or whatever, but you can't, you can appreciate the violin concerto, but you can't play the violin concerto, even if you can analyze it exhaustively. So it does seem like there's just a kind of fundamental gap between having a large body of factual information regarding how to do something and actually being able to do it, right? That's not to say that there aren't a lot of folks who have both, right? I mean, in an ideal situation, to me at least, it would seem that you want to be able to play the instrument and also read music and understand what you're doing and explain why it works the way that it does. But it just seems like these are different things at the end of the day, right? I'm open to thoughts on it, though. Maybe there's some more promising way to sell this. So here's the counterexample as Feldman sort of sets it out. So suppose Smith can play the piano perfectly, never had a lesson, knows nothing about formal aspects. Maybe this is my counterexample, but in any case, you get the idea. Seems like you can't plausibly claim that knowing how to play an instrument. Same with think of just about anything. Knowing how to water ski, knowing how to snow ski, if you've ever tried to do that, right? Knowing how to ride a bicycle. Everybody knows how to ride a bicycle, I'm assuming. Imagine if I said, okay, take the next 5 minutes and write down, how to ride a bicycle for somebody who's never ridden one. And then we're going to let them study that and then give them a bicycle and see how it doesn't work that way, right? They might know that, if I start to lean in this direction, I need to do this other thing. Or if I start to go too fast, I need to brake, ever so slightly. But knowing that's just not going to be any substitute for actually having practiced and done it. So there is a kind of response, I suppose, I've got it here, that maybe knowing how to do something is ambiguous between actually knowing between being able to do it and knowing that some set of steps is important in executing it. It doesn't seem to me, as I think about it now, though, that helps a whole lot. To point out that there's an ambiguity there, because it does seem like the core notion that we're after is this one right here, right? Is being able to do it. So this is maybe a good point for me before we go to the next big chunk that's going to occupy us for the rest of the time, maybe into next time, we'll see. Not a bad time to talk a little bit about the difference between about ambiguity and about vagueness, right? So some people that have had me before have heard this spiel, and I apologize for redundancies, but you'll be able to help. You can answer questions. So anybody want to take a stab at what is it for an expression, a word, a term, a phrase to be ambiguous? What's the difference between ambiguity and vagueness? Well, these are two problems that come up in connection with language, right? Natural languages. And one of the advantages of a formal language, whether it's first-order logic with identity, or some computer language, or the language of mathematics, elementary arithmetic, right? Those are formal languages, and they're purpose-built. They're constructed to be able to do certain things, and that's great. But natural languages, right? English, German, French, Japanese, Russian, these are, it's not the same thing there. And so that's where you get into a lot of these puzzles and problems. So what about ambiguity? Yeah.
Could it just be one of several options that it's unclear which one of the options it is that vagueness
Yeah, I think we're on the same page. Anybody want to say some more? So I mean, you're getting at the basic idea, which is that something's ambiguous if there's more than one of something, right? But presumably meanings, right? So take, simple kinds of examples. Take the word bank in English, right? It can mean a number of different things. If I say, Jones went to the bank yesterday, you say, well, how much money did he have in his account? Oh, no, he was fishing, went to the riverbank. So you can just subscript these things, bank 1, bank 2, right? However many senses we need. And that's what I recommend people do. I mean, this is not bad as a pedagogical move for your papers, right? Because it turns out that the details matter and that the language is important. It's not just splitting hairs and irrelevant semantics. So here we've got one sense of the word bank, another sense of the word bank. It's ambiguous, has more than one meaning, right? We find this a lot. What about vagueness? What's the difference? Because a lot of times people sort of run those together. They talk about something's ambiguous or something's vague, but they're really different linguistic phenomena. Yeah.
Wouldn't that just be like Bill is tall?
Yeah. So what's the issue there?
I mean, tall compared to who or compared to what? Like,
yeah.
If he's 6 foot tall, he wouldn't be very tall on a basketball team.
Right.
But just walking around playing soccer, he'd probably be tall.
For 5-year-olds.
Yeah.
He's a big kid. Right. We got some looking into to do there. Yeah. So clearly, I mean, if you've got something like tall, that's a great example. Right. Tall, rich. Right. How rich is rich? How tall is tall? How smart is smart? Right. Anything that you can kind of ask that, how F is F, right? What's going on there? So notice that with ambiguity, what we've got is we've got multiple meanings. And the only thing I can help you or encourage you to do there is that in your papers and in your own philosophical thinking, when there's, and sadly, a lot of the concepts that philosophers have sort of historically, been interested in are sort of rife through with problems involving ambiguity. I mean, that's why they're interesting. Think about it. Consciousness, knowledge, truth, beauty, right and wrong, cause, mind, God, right? Law. I mean, it seems like all the things that philosophers are really, these core concepts, they're open to the challenge or the charge that they're just multiply ambiguous. And so there's not, and somebody might say, well, look, there's not a right one. It's not a question of which one's the right one, unless there's a particular purpose that you've got in mind. They're just different, and so all you can do is just disambiguate them. Just say, okay, there's these 4 different things that this concept might mean. Let's take a look at each one, try to get as clear as we can. In the case of vagueness, we've got something different going on now, right? So we take the concept of being rich, just to have the example, right? So at the one end of the spectrum, we've got people that are, and I mean by this financial, personal net worth, not any other. So the word rich in English is ambiguous. It can mean different things, but we're going to skip that for now. You might be spiritually rich, but you don't have any money, let's suppose. So this is the financial concept, right? So at one end of the spectrum here, we've got people that are, everyone agrees, clearly they're rich. Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, right? Oprah, whoever. At the other end of the spectrum, we've got the folks that are clearly not rich in terms of personal net worth. If you've got no assets at all, right, then you're not rich. You have no home, no car, no source of income. That's a bad way to be, right? So we've got these extremes. There's no problem there. We know that the concept clearly applies. But what's going to happen is there's going to be some cases right in here. And these are what philosophers call the borderline cases. You'll hear people talk about this, so it's worth knowing. And Feldman uses this language some as well. Borderline cases are cases where you know all there is to know in terms of the facts of the matter, but you still can't tell whether or not the concept applies. It's frustrating, right? So if somebody's 6'2", pretty tall. I mean, taller than me, right? That seems tall, but are they tall or not? I mean, they're 6'2". Well, I don't know. It's kind of like Corey said. I mean, if we're talking about NBA basketball players, that's not tall. How tall is the tallest of the NBA players? Anybody know?
6'7".
I thought there were some 7-footers.
Yeah, 7.
Seven, like over 7 feet?
Yeah.
7'6"?
Now mainly the tallest.
Wow, I didn't realize they'd gotten much taller than 7 feet.
Yeah, 7'6".
Wow, I've been out of the loop for a while.
Yeah.
What's that?
He's like retired.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say that's just unbelievable. So, yeah, clearly, I mean that's off the scale. Very, very tall, right? But then again, 6'2", even 6 feet tall, depending on the situation, right? For jockeys, that's a really tall. It's not going to work. So all we can do in these cases is just acknowledge that there seem to be these borderlines. And you might think, well, hey, one way to kind of deal with this is just to specify a reference class, right? And sometimes that seems to work, right? But there do seem to be cases as well, like the concept of a heap. Are people familiar with the Sorites paradox of the heap? So the idea is take a heap of something. This is a classical paradox called the Sorites. Is the technical name for it. So take a heap of sand, just a big pile of sand, right? And it's made up of all the individual grains that compose the heap. And take a principle that says, look, 1 grain of sand, take 1 grain away, that's not gonna make it go from being a heap to not being a heap. So you have to regiment the principle. There'll be some principle that'll say, for any heap, you remove a grain, you still got a heap. That seems like a principle you can iterate that's pretty good. So you do that. You take 1 grain away, and you still got a heap. You take another grain away, you see where this is going. Well, eventually, before you know it, you're down to just, you've crossed over, and you don't have a heap anymore. You've got 2 grains of sand, and you take 1 away, and you've got a single grain. But somewhere in that process, and you can't tell where it seems like it went from being a heap to not being a heap. And it doesn't seem like it's not a matter of counting the grains or eyeballing it, right? Because presumably, if you're already in the borderline range, 1 grain to the left or right is not going to make a difference there. So people that work in philosophy of language and some folks in philosophical logic and in metaphysics have struggled with how to deal with vagueness. And there's been a lot of really interesting work done. Some people talk about truth-value gaps and predicates like super true and super false. Professor King, one of our professors here, late Professor King, he wrote some papers on this that are in the philosophy library if you're interested in checking them out on vagueness that are really kind of fun. But the main thing is just keep track of the difference between ambiguity and vagueness because it does make a difference. And the sad thing is you might sad thing, but the reality seems to be that concepts like a person, right, the concept of a person, arguably could be both ambiguous and vague. In other words, the concept of a person might have multiple meanings depending on the context, and it might also be vague in some cases whether what you're dealing with is or isn't a person. At the very beginnings of life, at the very end of life, hard to know for sure, right? And you might think the same thing for some of these epistemic concepts. Maybe you think that knowledge is multiply ambiguous. Maybe you think that there are going to be cases where it's vague. I don't know. These are ideas that you can contemplate, you can think about, right? Okay. So on to the next part. A little bit more to where I want to be headed here. All right. So the traditional analysis. TAK. Right. So Feldman uses this schema, and we'll see it from here on out in the book. This idea of S knows P or S knows that P, right? And the goal seems to be to kind of fill in the blank. And in my experience teaching this at different levels, in some cases in introductory courses a little bit, and then in upper level courses where there's a lot more detail to come, students catch on to this, I think, pretty quickly. And you've maybe had some exposure to this yourself. The idea, of course, is to fill in the blank, right? So some agent, S, that's going to be our variable ranging over putative knowers, and I want to think about that a little bit too in a minute. Knows some proposition P, and if you wanted to add a time index just to keep it as detailed as possible, you could. So S knows that P is true at time T if and only if blank. Right? We're going to fill in the blank. This general approach is often called conceptual analysis. All right? And the idea is that we're taking a concept and we're breaking it down into its fundamental elements. Right? The analogy that I've used before is kind of, you could quibble with the analogy, I suppose, but I think it's good as far as it goes. Think about chemical analysis, right? So you've got some substance. I've got something in my Tate Street coffee cup here. Came out of the water fountain. We can only hope that it's water, right? You never know. I haven't tested it. The idea would be to take this substance and break it down into its basic parts, and hopefully we would find out that it's hydrogen and oxygen bound together in the appropriate way, right? That doesn't mean that we stop using the word water. Quite to the contrary, right? We're still going to talk about water. We're going to say, hey, do you know where I can get some bottled water? Have you checked out the water in the water fountain? Whatever, right? Our ordinary concept of water stays the same and continues to be serviceable, and we use it, right? But we feel like giving that kind of an analysis of that substance provides us with some deeper insight into its nature. We learn something different about it, right? We learn its chemical structure. And that's useful and interesting on its own, right? I should also add here that I don't, and I'm not assuming that the meaning of the word water is the same as the meaning of the chemical expression H2O. I think they're not. So in other words, before we had hydrogen chemistry, people used the word water. They meant things by that. They expressed truths using that word, and they had no clue about hydrogen and oxygen. That seems right to me. What does that show or not show? Well, it depends. In the philosophy of language, some of these things become issues, right? I mean, there are folks that want to say that the meaning of a concept or term is the thing that it refers to. And if that thing has an essence, some sort of microstructure, like an atom of gold or water or whatever, right? Then you might think that could be the proxy for its meaning. But this is all debatable. So in any case, we take this concept, right, water, and we break it down into its parts. It's kind of like an exploded diagram, if you've ever seen one of those of an engine, let's say, where they take this complicated thing, an engine, it's got all these parts, it's a mechanism, and they break it apart, and they show how all the parts are interrelated, right? Why do that? Well, presumably there's something to be gained from that. We get a deeper understanding, right? It's not the end-all, be-all, perhaps, but it takes us a little closer to this thing that we're interested in. Well, in the same way, I think that's what philosophers are trying to do when we analyze concepts. So whether it's our concept of God, or knowledge, or truth, or beauty, or justice, or morally right action, the concept of a person, you pick your favorite. I think that's what we've been trying to do. Now, there's a lot of debate, more now perhaps than in a long time, over the status of this very method. There are philosophers that cling to it, think that it sort of has an important role to play, an important place, and there are people that are more critical of it and that think that there are limitations, there are problems built into the method. I don't want to have to take a stand on it right now, but that's also a topic. If someone gets interested in the sort of epistemological methodology, I'll be happy to help you out there. So some constraints on a successful analysis. That's where all of this is headed. We could just start trying, throwing things out randomly and trying to fill in the blank and be done with the program, but that's not going to help us. What are some constraints on what goes in the blank? Well, for one thing, notice that whether it's equals by definition or whether it's if and only if, the two sides have to balance out, as it were, right? So anytime the left-hand side is true, the right-hand side has to be true. Anytime the left is false, the right has to be false. So what that means is if you can find a case where one side is true but the other side's not, or one side holds and the other side doesn't, you've got what we call a counterexample. All right? curious thing about these counterexamples, you already know this because you've taken some philosophy, but they don't have to be actual cases. In fact, in most cases, they're not. They're hypothetical cases. They're imaginary. They're merely possible. And I think this is, again, part of where some of the recent resistance to this as a method comes from. There are folks out there that worry about the reliance on hypothetical, kind of crazy, exotic, science fiction-y sounding examples, right? And that, I understand the concern, but there's a motivation for this, right? I mean, for one thing, we can't escape possibility and necessity. These modal notions they're critical to the kind of work that philosophers want to do. Why is that? Well, because we're interested in trying to figure out what the nature of knowledge is. We don't want to know. We're not interested in what it just happens to be, right? Accidentally, perhaps, or locally. The original Socratic mission, right, that Plato kind of embarks on, is to try to get at the heart of the concept, right? Assuming that there is some essential feature or nature, that there is something that all genuine cases of knowledge have in common. Now, you might say, I'm not on board anymore. I think knowledge is a social construction. I think it's used to oppress people. I think it's used to all these different purposes socially, whatever. And I don't think there's necessarily anything that all cases of knowledge have in common. So that would be it. That's a radical view, in my opinion. Derek.
Yeah, is there any way is there any way to possibly, is there any way to take out possibility?
I don't.
There's no.
I don't see any way around it. I mean.
Nothing that just is.
Thanks. No, if I'm on the same page here, if I'm getting you, then I share your kind of frustration and concern a little bit here. There's a temptation to want to say philosophers are too preoccupied with stuff that's not real. Why is it that, you're in a philosophy class for just a few minutes, and the next thing you know, you're talking about the Matrix, or you got some Star Trek example, or somebody saying, imagine a possible world where, and it's like there seem to be no limits to how kind of far out and detached from the concerns of daily life the examples can get. So I understand that. Why are we worried about brains in vats? We don't have brains in vats. We've got brains inside of skulls, right? I mean, hopefully it'll stay that way. But I think the reason why is because if all you're interested in is how things happen to be, the way they actually are, that looks like science. To me, that looks like that's the mission of the natural sciences, right? To characterize and categorize, classify, and describe the world as we find it. But to make the additional claim and say, oh, and by the way, that's what the essence of these things are, right, or is. I don't see that they can make that claim without having to be squarely within the realm of modality and claims about necessity. Now, there are philosophers, it's maybe the different group than the ones that would say, hey, knowledge is a construction, there's no such thing, it's not a real thing, it's a made-up thing, right? And because it's a made-up concept, there's no essence to it. In other words, there need not be anything that all cases that are labeled as knowledge have in common, right? I'm not on that side. But I grant that there are people out there that might be sympathetic to that. And if so, that could be a great paper topic. That could be something fun to write about. I'd enjoy reading it. So there's that kind of angle on things, right, as well. But there are also going to be folks of a more traditional bent that are going to say, well, look, I mean, on the assumption that that we know a few things, the things the standard view says we do, at least in some cases, right, then it's not crazy to think that there would have to be something that all genuine cases of knowledge have in common. What would it be? What's the underlying thing? What is it that all cases of water have in common, or all instances of water? Well, they all have the same microstructure, presumably. I mean, I'm not a chemist, and so if there are folks out there that know that that's not true, shoot me an email. Don't embarrass me in class. No, just kidding. So I know the details here can come back to bite you. But you get the idea, right? I mean, it would be nice. Maybe this is just optimism on our part. Maybe there are no essences to things. But I think that analytic philosophers of a certain stripe have thought, hey, this is worth exploring. Let's see if there's something in virtue of which all red things are called red. All humans are called humans, right? These underlying kind of natures to things. So that's really kind of what we're out to do here with knowledge. That's really dark. I don't know why. I guess it's just the sun. Sorry. So one constraint, this is a long-winded way of getting there, but one constraint on filling in the blank successfully, aside from the fact that the left-hand side and the right-hand side have to always share the same truth value, and that's not just, that's across all possible space. So even if it's an imaginary case, if you can come up with an imaginary case where the left-hand side is true and the right-hand side's not, then you've got a counterexample and the theory is false. That's how it works, right? So one of the constraints on a successful conceptual analysis is that the analysis express a necessary truth about the concept. Now, if you're somebody, and I use this kind of rhetorically here, if and there are folks who have doubts about necessity, they don't believe in genuine necessity, they don't believe in logical necessity, metaphysical necessity, what have you, then we're going to have to sit down and talk. That's going to be a different discussion, right? It's just like the folks that don't believe in the a priori, a posteriori distinction. The people that I have in mind here tend to hang out together. They tend to be empiricists in their sort of leanings. And that's okay. A lot of smart empiricists out there as well. So the two sides need to always share the same truth value, right? Whatever goes in the blank needs to express a necessary truth about the concept. So we have to consider the space of logical space here, right? All these different possibilities, not just the actual cases. And what else? Well, it can't be circular. We can't say S knows that P if S has knowledge that P. That's true, and it's necessarily true, but it's trivial. It's not interesting, right? What about another constraint? It's hard to know exactly how to word it, but here's the idea. Whatever goes in the blank, in some sense, should be more basic. The elements, assuming that this thing is so you think of like water, right? It's a complicated thing. It's a molecule. It's got parts. Think about an engine or your iPhone or whatever, right? It's a complicated mechanism. It's got parts. So when you're doing the exploded diagram and when you're putting it all back together, those parts are ultimately, it's important that they fit properly, they function properly, and that they compose this greater thing, right? Same sort of thing here. On the assumption that knowledge is a complex property or relation, presumably it's got some parts. And if you've read, you know that it does, right? But those parts in some sense are more basic. Why is that? Well, because we're not getting anywhere if we start filling in the blank with even more complicated properties, relations, things of that sort. We're going in the wrong direction, right? Here's a constraint that I don't actually embrace, but there are epistemologists out there that do, typically naturalists. Some people want to require that not only all those things I just mentioned, but that whatever goes in the blank, if it has a bunch of parts or whatever, that all of those resulting concepts be amenable to natural scientific inquiry, or be the kinds of concepts that a scientist would be happy to have in their theorizing. What's another way of saying it? Well, some people say that the analysis can't contain any normative concepts or evaluative concepts, right? You can see maybe why they would want to insist on that, right? Because take the one we're working with here, knowledge. You know that one of the constituent parts is going to be justification, right? But justification itself seems like a normative notion. In other words, there's an evaluative dimension to that concept, right? To be justified in believing something is to appraise one's belief in a certain way, right? To assess it, to evaluate it, to say, okay, there are the beliefs that are justified and there are the beliefs that are unjustified. That's an evaluative sort of move, right? And so you might think, well, look, we're not done yet. If you've got evaluative concepts or notions that are figuring in the analysis, then those things have to ultimately be eliminated as well. They have to be reduced out, or they have to somehow be theoretically eliminable, right? As I say, I don't insist on that. I'm content to have some irreducibly evaluative notions in an analysis, but this is a matter of debate. All right. So where do we go from here? The first two ideas, right? Truth and belief. So S knows that P equals by definition, or if and only if P is true. So to test this and see how we're doing here, I'm tempted to put the blind down here. Is this the one that's giving us the trouble? Or is it the back? Yeah, there we go. So we want to test and see if we're done. You know we're not done, right? It'd be too easy. It'd be a really short course. So what's the problem with this one? What if we tried to analyze knowledge as truth and just call it a day and we could all head to Starbucks? Be a fun day. Or maybe people aren't seeing the problem. Maybe it sounds good to me, right? Knowledge, truth, it's all good stuff. Anybody got a counterexample? Yeah, Anthony.
I guess we have to find some proof for it being true.
Say again?
Some proof for it being true.
Oh, so the idea would be that we need to help me make sure I'm following you here. So
confuse myself.
yeah, no. I mean, here's the idea, right? I mean, we're going to try to analyze what our concept of knowledge is, and the first proposal is that S knows some proposition if and only if the proposition's true. So now you want to ask yourself, does it go in both directions, right? Is it the case that any time someone knows a proposition, the proposition has to be true, and is the reverse true, right? Is it the case that any time a proposition's true, somebody thereby has knowledge of it? You know, you're shaking your head because you know that's not right.
No, that's not.
Yeah, so why not?
Because it doesn't, there's a counterexample in the statement itself that just because both sides, just because something is true doesn't mean someone knows it.
Yeah, exactly, right? And Feldman gets to this. I think he's got some counterexamples in here along the way. I may have you guys read them at some point. So, yeah, I mean, what's pretty glaringly here, it seems, he talks about this, right? That, I mean, everybody's going to agree. I say everybody's going to agree. There'll be somebody, right, that won't. But hopefully everyone can agree that any genuine case of knowing involves a truth, right? I mean, if the proposition's not true, then you don't know it. You can't know a falsehood, right? So his example is that you can't know that Thomas Jefferson's the first president of the United States. You can believe it. You could have all the justification in the world for thinking it's true. But you'd be wrong. It won't be knowledge, right? Because it's not the case, right? So it does seem pretty clear, at least to me, but you guys help me out, that any genuine case of knowledge is gonna involve the propositions being true. You can't know a falsehood. But if you're puzzling over that, or if you find yourself thinking, I don't know, why can't you know something that's false? I mean, people say all kinds of weird things. Then stop me and let's talk about it. But what I'm concerned about is the other direction. Is it the case that any time P is true, somebody knows that P is true? Hopefully there's a lot of different ways to try to get yourself convinced that that's not the case. One is to notice that over here, the P is true part that's going in the blank doesn't mention S at all. So if we're trying to analyze the thing on the left-hand side, and it's this complex, it appears to be this complex relation, right? A relation between an agent and a proposition, possibly at a time or whatever, right? Then presumably whatever falls out on the other side of the analysis better have S in there too somewhere. And you know because you've read it that S gets into the picture eventually. Yeah.
So the way I'm reading this is, so say for example, a huge prime number that we haven't figured out yet.
Yeah.
And scientists, they got these supercomputers and they're working on it, and someone's like, well, I'm going to draw this number out of a hat. And that happens to be a prime number, but it's when they haven't figured out yet. How is that knowledge? because it seems that that's saying it's true that prime
Yeah.
number is a prime, that number is a prime.
Yeah.
But
No, it's not. Right, you're right. So that's, you've got a counterexample. That's a great example, right? So some gigantic number that we don't know whether it's prime yet or not, right? But there's a fact of the matter, because it's a mathematical claim, and if it's true, then it's necessarily true, and if it's not true, it's impossible, right? So there's already a fact, and we just don't know it. That would seem to be a great counterexample. Thanks. Yeah. So, let's suppose that it is prime. This giant number is prime. That's true, but nobody knows it because we haven't been able to figure that part out. So we've got to add more to it than that. And here's go ahead and move it down. So here's the counterexample, right? Truth's and this is the right way to word it. Truth is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for knowledge. Think about that for a second, because necessary and sufficient conditions, in my experience, really give students a hard time. And I mean, they give ordinary folks a hard time, right? People are not great at reasoning with conditionals, but you need to spend a minute thinking about it. So only if, right, indicates a necessary condition, and if indicates a sufficient condition, right? So if I say, if P then Q, P is a sufficient condition for Q. If I say P only if Q, Q is a necessary condition for P, right? So what we're trying to do here in this analysis is we're trying to construct a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. If we can do that, if it's possible, then we'll have successfully analyzed a concept, and you can think of what we've got then as a kind of philosophical definition. Again, it's not a dictionary definition, any more than H2O is the dictionary definition of water, which it's not, right? I mean, the definition's going to be, I don't know, something like watery substance that falls from the heavens as rain, fills our rivers and streams, people can, whatever. It's going to involve descriptors and how the substance impinges on our senses. So in any case, truth is necessary but not sufficient for knowing. All that is a kind of fancy way of saying anytime someone can correctly be said to know, the proposition in question has to be true. But the sheer fact that you've got a true proposition out there doesn't imply that anyone has any knowledge of it. And that hopefully that seems right to you, because presumably there are all kinds of truths out there right now that we're completely unaware of, whether it be scientific discoveries that we've yet to make, or even propositions that'll never be known, right? They're lost to the distant past, whatever, right? Setting aside God's omniscience and knowing everything for now. All right, so we got to add something else, and the other thing that I hope kind of stands out the more you start thinking about it is this sort of the fact again that we're trying to analyze a complex relational property, namely knowing, and it has at least two obvious parts to it. There's the knower, and there's the thing that's known. So there's S, and there's P, right? The proposition. To say that P is true, the first condition, that just handles that part. We got to get S into the picture. How do we do that, right? Well, looks like we need to add belief, right? So this move, again, turns knowledge into a species of belief. All right? Think about it for a second. So you've got all these beliefs. You've got the world of truths out here, let's suppose. Right? All the truths that there are. And then you've got, actually, let me do it this way. It'd be easier. Here are the beliefs, right? Some of these beliefs are going to be true, right? Let that be the set of true beliefs right there. It's going to be a subset. You're going to have a whole bunch of them out here that are not true. Presumably, we're narrowing down the field, right? And within this class right here, we're going to have another condition. In fact, we're going to have two more conditions eventually, right? So what do we need to add? Well, the traditional analysis adds belief as the second condition. So S knows that P equals by definition, or if and only if P is true and S believes that P is true, right? So true belief is, I don't want to reveal that just yet. All right. So what do people think? And if there's examples that Feldman gives here, we could take a look at. So he's got a bunch of different ones, right? He's got the mystery story. This is on page 13, example 2.1, and the knowing your name example, right? And then ultimately the pessimistic picnic planner, my favorite guy. So here's the thing. It does seem like when you reflect on cases of knowledge, right? So just describe either an actual one or a hypothetical one. It does seem like when you reflect on those, that they are cases of true belief, right? But does it go the other direction? Is it the case that every time you have a true belief, you've also got a case of knowledge? I'm seeing some heads shaking. Why not? Anybody want to take a stab at it?
I guess that knowledge around the business sometimes just
Yeah, but why? Why can't we just go with true belief and be done? I mean, think about it. Truth is outside. I mean, right? We don't get to call the shots when it comes to truth, right? The objective theory of truth, the correspondence theory of truth, makes truth this kind of objective fact about reality. So the world's fixed in various ways. We have these sentences, right, that express propositions that try to characterize and describe the way the world is. But we don't, for the most part, we're not, what's true and false isn't up to us. It gets complicated, but in general, that's sort of the picture. So truth is a kind of external feature. Belief, now that's something that's up to us in a way. I mean, setting aside debates about voluntarism and whether or not beliefs are under, the extent to which believing is up to you or under your control, that's kind of a hot topic. But setting that aside, I mean, belief is clearly a psychological attitude, right, a mental state, and that's something that, in some sense, is part of something you can control. You can do something about that. Why can't we just let it go at that? So the proposition's true, then you believe it's true. Do you know it? Somebody give me a counterexample? There's lots of them, right? And here's this kind of a strategy too. I should mention this as we're going along throughout the rest of the semester. When you're trying to come up with counterexamples to these things, try to break the parts, keep the parts separated, right? So don't think about it all in one chunk. Think about, okay, I got to make P true, and then I've also got to get S believing P, right? So it can be, they're just separated out. So we need a true statement, and S needs to believe it, but it needs to be pretty clear to all of us that S doesn't know it. Cool. Yeah, Anthony. Yeah, that's the problem, right? Lucky guesses. And Feldman gives a number of different examples here, right? So there was one, I think, involving was it a sports example, maybe? Where the odds on the teams are even or whatever, and the person says, oh, I think the Bills are going to win, or whatever it is, right? And it turns out that they do. So it's true that team wins, and the person believes that team's going to win, but it was just a lucky guess, right? They just happened to get it right. Cases like that are not cases of knowledge. Why not? Now, and it's a legitimate challenge for someone to say, well, why not? Well, because whatever else we want to say about knowledge and what it is, it's not supposed to be coincidental. It's not supposed to be happenstance or fluky, right? I mean, the thing that separates the person who has knowledge from the person who's just getting it right by luck, that's the distinctive element, right? So what is that element? What do we need to add? So what's yeah, Anthony? Yeah, right. So there's got to be something that the person who really has knowledge has got that the lucky guesser doesn't have, right? And presumably it's support for his or her belief, something to back it up, right? And that component we call the justification condition. I'll stop with that for now. We'll pick it up next time. Thanks, folks. And if you haven't had a chance or haven't looked at discussion 3, please do so. It's out there for you. Did it kill it? No.